two world powers, a diminishing one and a one on the rise. But was there also something about this idea of characters that are lost, who don't know where they are, or something about, I don't know, it's kind of masculinity, these lost men who just drink? Tell me a bit more about that.
Deny being one of them. So, yeah, it was fascinating. Most of my friends there were 10 years older, and they'd been through a lot of the problems. I mean, Hong Kong was, as many of you know, was not the easiest place to be for me. There was amazing highs and low lows. So certainly, and we'll get onto this later, I think the kind of the places I'd go where I'd meet other expats, and actually quite an international crowd, were people who told me tall tales, some of which are in the book, and also kind of helped me through what I was dealing with there. And yeah, they are lost souls in some ways. Hong Kong, in a way, is an easy place to be if you're an expat. You can speak English. You can teach English, like the character you heard, Paul, at the start of the book. And you can probably do okay, but you do have to, you're perhaps still looking for your own identity and how you belong there. And that was something that always fascinated me, because I was asking the same questions of myself, really. And if I wanted to be there and how long I wanted to stay, etc. Yeah.
Do you want to read the next bit?
Certainly, yeah. So this next part is certainly linked to that, the fragility of life for people of all nationalities in Hong Kong. But it also introduces the thriller element to the book. There's a young character in the book called Ray, who we're not so sure what his motives are. And he's being observed by Paul, who you've met in the first chapter, and Nick, who narrates the book, who is also a little unpredictable and unreliable. There are cracks here, it's true. The secret is not to fall down them. If you do, you will be consumed. A young man is running down the middle of Queen's Road, dodging the sparse, medicated traffic. He is barefoot. He is panting convincingly. There is a red welt across one side of his face. This could be a birthmark, or he may have been smacked across the face. If anything is going to snap Paul out of his melancholy, it is the sight of someone in greater need than him running directly towards us. Oh shit, I see it coming, a fraction too late. $20, pants the youngster. Paul is already reaching for his wallet, the sucker. What's happened, I ask. The boy's face is sallow, the neon from the nearby shops rouging his pronounced cheekbones, but failing to bring his features to life. His eyes shine black like Neolithic tar pits. He is a creature of the night. Need money, he says. Bad men. Later, I will ask Paul if he thinks the stranger is deliberately hiding his language abilities. Even relatively uneducated Hong Kongers speak better English than the mute Wi-Fi Brits I encounter at home these days. In any case, it's my right to be suspicious, lest we forget George W. Bush is deliberately dumbing down to win the votes of the defiantly ignorant that Trump so graciously inherited further down the line. Paul says it's hard to tell, but he thinks the lad is the real deal, a genuine dumbass. Where have you come from? I ask, putting a stiff arm between his outstretched hand and Paul's gaping wallet. Restaurant. He points in the direction of Stonewall Lane. Nowhere in the new development, I tell Paul. He's been somewhere subterranean. Somewhere up a back alley that's escaped gentrification, possibly by supernatural means. You're drunk, Paul tells me. He's just a lad in trouble. Had a fight with his missus or his mum or something. Where are his shoes? I ask Paul, and then the boy, where are your shoes? He shrugs and smiles, and in the same languorous movement manages to extract a $50 note from Paul's elastic reach. Christ, I despair. The youth turns to me expectantly. I reach for my own wallet and open it. I ignore the neat row of hundreds and instead extract a business card. If you give me a call, I look at him with my negotiator's eyes. I'll buy you a new pair of trainers. Okay. He snatches my card, pockets it and glares into the semi-darkness from where he's run. Just a couple of winking indicators, dormant traffic lights and lines of shuttered up shops, so far as we can tell, but he seems spooked all over again. Without another word, he sets off in the opposite direction at speed, disappearing beyond our 7-Eleven and heading towards the nearest shut-up MTR station.
So, thank you, Pete. I've been wondering, when I read the novel, I was thinking a lot about how the history of other writers that have influenced you, and also you can't get away from the issue of writing about another country, which is about Hong Kong, which is an ex-colony. And I was wondering about, first of all, before we talk about the politics, which I think are a really important part of your book, a little bit about the influences and which writers have influenced that writing, and ways in which you may have also moved away from their positions as well.
Yeah, well, I think like a lot of writers who are somewhere else, you look to other expatriate writers, and the ones who write very well. So authors like Graham Greene and Anthony Burgess, George Orwell, writers you instinctively admire for their technique and way with words. But pretty soon you perhaps realise, and as I was writing the book, their point of view is not always perhaps the one you want to communicate yourself or inhabit yourself. And so that's part of the reason why the novel ended up from the viewpoint of multiple narrators. Obviously their technical skills and their description influenced me a lot. And I wanted to read about Hong Kong history, of course. I wanted to know as much as possible. I was lucky to have the friends who were journalists and other writers who educated me. And I found even the Chinese authors I read in translation were not necessarily contemporary writers. Eileen Chang, who's an incredible writer who was writing about Shanghai in the 1930s, a bit like the noirish music tonight, she was writing like a kind of noir tales of espionage in the 1930s in Japan, where it was that relationship that was uneasy, as Japan obviously eventually invaded China. And that was intriguing, and Lu Xun, who is writing in pre-revolutionary China, and he has quite a sort of bumbling narrator who never really grasps the politics of the situation, a bit like Nick in the book. And it's a different time, but obviously you recognise some of the same things that are happening now, the sort of the shifting power balances between different nations and who's really in control and the conspiracies, and obviously things like the film Casablanca also inspire that because you recognise elements of it. So it wasn't so much contemporary authors, but certainly what I would hear and how I would engage with people I met in Hong Kong. There's a great art scene, there's filmmakers, musicians. They were an inspiration as well. So it's a mixture of all those things, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember how it seems that within the texture of the novel itself, you're also aware of the kind of the power imbalance of who speaks about a place and whose voice is heard. As as we saying, like the British male characters are very ineffectual and a bit useless. But there's also within the story there's a kind of a balance check within the voices, and they're kind of also kind of lectured through as well. Need to realise that they don't have that kind of the power they thought they had. Would you like to read the next bit?
Certainly, yeah. Okay. So the third extract, most of the novel is narrated by Nick, who's a bit of a ne'er-do-well. He has succeeded, or he thinks he's succeeded, in disguising his own death from from his wife, which is a bit of a challenge. And here he is witnessing his wife doing an intense physical activity. Nothing dodgy. This is all about running, actually. This is the culture of hashing in Hong Kong, which is running through the countryside and then drinking lots of booze. I think it started in Singapore. People will go and do this. There's a typhoon hash group who will only run during typhoons. They're a bit crazy, but they enjoy their sport. So this is Nick looking at his ex as she indulges in this. Chapter 8. I have to remind myself not to be surprised on seeing Lennox's long limbs bursting out of the shiggy terrain in the valley below. All that pent-up energy and frustration, fermented on the long haul back from Latin America, compounded in some hostile security hub in the States, had to find an outlet somewhere. And wasn't part of the hashing code for these drinkers with a running problem about catharsis and recovery, more often from the weekend successes, but perhaps also from the unexpected death of an estranged husband? On come the distant cries of her fellow hounds as they crush another chalk-marked arrow underfoot. Forward, forward, for the living, where else is there to go? For members of the undead, like myself, a more circumspect view may be taken. Here in limbo, there is no need to exist in a narrative straight line. I can amble through the past, present and future without fear of messing them up any more than I have already. At the same time aware that even small actions and events resonate indefinitely, and our perceived histories are as much subject to change as our fragile futures. For example, the tall, pale woman with the ensnared red hair in the white vest, Squeaky Bum, to give Lennox her honorary hashing name, must once have had a settled rear view of me and her as lovers. Romantic in our way as we flopped into bed together, as easy in our interactions as two old soldiers in a familiar foxhole. Likewise, her future imaginings, like mine, must have hinged around a leisurely continuation of a love that would prove all too easy to take for granted. Inevitably, those memories and projections have since changed within that distant, bobbing cranium. To what extent and in what ways I do not know. But the fact remains that hashing codes and ancient rites aside, the woman I love is out there tearing up the Saikong countryside instead of sitting at home weeping over what was and could have been.
It seems when you're writing about this running, this hashing done by this kind of driven workers who then, after working 12 hours, then go running insanely around the countryside. That you're writing about a place of extremes, and on one hand you've got a Hong Kong of work ethic, of consumerism, of a capitalist mode, and then there's the other aspect of Hong Kong, which is embodied through the bar, the wonderful Yellow Brolly, and a hostel where there's lots of people meet, there's artists, there's writers, there's lots of drinking, and this kind of anti-capitalist mode and something that becomes the kind of soup of fermentation of what we've seen currently now, of the huge resistance in Hong Kong that's happened after you wrote this book. There's a lot of that begins in, you can see it there happening within the narrative. I mean, it's a place of, it seems, I've learned a lot from, I've not been there, through this kind of contradiction of different, it's like a war between two different, is that how you feel about Hong Kong, this sense of this battle between these different, what Hong Kong is, and these different sense of values as well?
It is to some extent, but there's also, it is certainly between different groups who are active politically and socially, but there's also a kind of person who goes to Hong Kong, and I was lucky enough to play football there as well, in the sweltering heat, kind of lucky for that, to do that, but you'd meet bankers who've simply gone there to earn enough money to buy a house in London for 1 year, and they didn't want to engage. And their pubs would be the pubs with sports cars outside, drinking champagne, etc. So you can do that, you can go and do that if you want, and again, this is from the expat point of view, or you can try and learn about where you are, and it's a nutritional place to live, and if you're there amongst the tower blocks and you know, you've got the climate to deal with, which comes across here. I mean, it's sort of, sounds a bit strange on a very cold night in Lancaster, but that's definitely a factor, and it's so crowded. But you can move out, as some of the characters do, to these islands, and you can live a different existence, and you can have pause for thought, and perhaps that thought will be political, perhaps not. Everything's been accelerated recently, obviously, and people have had to sort of show what their side they're on. So, for example, my workmates, I didn't realise were engaged at all politically, and you know, where I was working, it was mostly with Hong Kong Chinese colleagues, and people were marching, people were demonstrating, and I didn't realise why they weren't doing that, but in a way it's like the protest movement now. It's not really about egos and people standing up, you know, it's a quiet kind of education. This is what happened, this is the legislation that was passed here, this is the... I found older colleagues, still in their late 20s, passing on that education. And people deciding, the stakes are high now, deciding how they're going to take a stand. And some people, if they're privileged enough, don't have to do that. You know, they can make of Hong Kong, they can treat it like a playground. And it's up to you what journey you find yourself in. It was a sort of a mixture to me. But I'm glad I kind of, you know, stayed there as long as I did, and hopefully learn a few things about the place.
Would you like to read the next bit?
Sure. So one of the conceits in the book is actually, this was written, as Zoe says, before the current acceleration in the protest. One of the conceits in the book is there's actually legislation against expats to say, what are you doing? What are you contributing to Hong Kong and soon China as well? So the expats are being asked to justify their existence over there, which may be a good thing. But so in this bit, this is kind of a satire on protest. It's actually the expatriates who are protesting in this scene. And again, Nick, who believes he's undercover completely now, is looking on and seeing his friends protesting. A few weeks ago, the Macau hydrofoil struck something large and mysterious as it sped out of Hong Kong harbour with its quota of gamblers, 2 of whom sustained serious injuries in the collision. Some say they hit a barnacle-encrusted whale, lured into the shipping lanes by improved fish stocks, or else seeking revenge on the fucker-uppers of the sea in a passive-aggressive way. Others claim they hit a Chinese sub, bang within its right to be patrolling here. Either way, the speed limit has been lowered and ferries advised to take extra precautions, something that is surely helping to keep the Christina, a thin sliver of yacht manned by Frank, Paul, Fenton and an unidentified local sailor, afloat. "Stand up for expat rights," Frank yells towards the vast blue and yellow hull of the Lama ferry. "Deputations, not deportations." I lower the bill of my HSBC branded baseball cap and peek out of the nearest window, taking a mental snapshot before the captain swings us round again in an ongoing attempt to circumnavigate the Christina and reach our allotted berth. "Hong Kong, not China! Hong Kong, not China!" Paul and Fenton are huddled together looking sheepish or seasick, but Frank is standing firm on the churning water, blue-green today, with wave tips paint-flecked with effulgent emulsion. The sailor manning the tiller I now recognise as Kim. While Frank, Paul and Fenton wear white t-shirts daubed with slogans reflecting the homemade banners tied to the mast. "We would die for HK2, unite, suffrage for all." Kim opts for navy blue slacks and a figure obscuring orange life jacket. I wonder if discretion is the best part of valour for her. Perhaps our uncle has insisted on her anonymity, because having recognised Kim, I'm now remembering that this is his boat, and was last boarded by Guilos, to the best of my knowledge, during an infamous junk trip off Sai Kung, at which a pilling partygoer shat in his trunks and puked in his mask, in which order, I can't be sure.
Thank you, Pete. I mean, I was saying before that, you know, when you wrote the novel, you weren't to imagine the kind of how much things would accelerate in the couple of years afterwards, and what is now happening in Hong Kong. We're always actually seeing prescient that it would change. I think it's good that you had like the focus on the Brits there, and you wrote their story instead of trying to assume the story of others. But I mean, there's politics beneath in the novel. I mean, how important was that, and what kind of politics was important to what you wanted to communicate in it?
It became increasingly important and quite complicated as well. When I got to Hong Kong, I was struck by, as anyone is who's living there, the relative freedom to protest, and also to pay tribute to things like Tiananmen, which every the 4th of June there'll be a candlelit vigil in Hong Kong in which people would sit down peacefully, light candles for the victims of what happened there. And there were also, early protest marches, just people keeping an eye on what may or may not happen. As you may know, Hong Kong is due to be absorbed back into China in 2047, but there seemed to be signs that was being accelerated, really. But it was somewhere people could go, and you know, what happened with the politics really was I would attend some of these marches and see Union Jacks, which made me feel very strange, because you know, there was almost a sentimentality, especially amongst young people, for the colonial days, which obviously, you know, is quite hard to kind of process. And then from that point onwards, really, it got to the point during Occupy in 2014, where, you know, I was there witnessing it. Also, some of the media, certainly the Chinese government, were saying that this was a Western-backed protest movement in some way. So suddenly it became a bit more complicated to be a tall, gangly white guy who's there, you know, who's kind of trying to sort of stick up for what you see as kind of, you know, these universal human rights, and it becomes very complicated. And the way I realised I had to write it was just to observe what I'd seen, and to, as much as possible, give a variety of viewpoints, which is how it expanded to this multiple narrative form. And it's there, and it's kind of accelerated. So I wanted it to be a page-turning novel. I didn't want it to be a political book, but the politics is almost inevitable in Hong Kong, and even more so now. So I didn't have a particular method of dealing with that, but I wanted to, like you were saying earlier, it's a love letter to Hong Kong. It's also a love letter to my friends, who, you know, my Hong Kong Chinese friends who don't have a choice. The expats can leave at any point, you know. But if you're there and that's your place and you can't go anywhere else, you know, that's something that gave me it allowed me a huge respect for those people I met. And since then, it's obviously linked into other protest movements around the world, and how you process, which is a whole new, you know, a whole other subject, really. So.
Yeah, no, even recently during, I've been on the strikes at Lancaster University, and the Hong Kong students have been there. They joined the protest, and we felt it was really emotional when we saw them, and they all had the black face masks to cover them, and I was quite conscious that when I took photos, not to take photos that they would make them recognisable, because there's this sense of censorship, and their vulnerability even when they are abroad. And also, I mean, there's the booksellers who have been arrested in your book, and recently one who was arrested abroad has just been given 10 years imprisonment. And so I feel like that's all there. It's kind of part of the narrative. It's you know, you can't escape it in Hong Kong. But there's also, well, you know, I like how you've got the multiple viewpoints without overly owning any of them. And in some of those viewpoints as well, there's, would you like to read the next bit? Jeannie and Kim.
Sure, thanks, Zoe. So this is two of the female characters, one of whom is the landlady of the pub where a lot of this discussion about the future of Hong Kong, as well as a bit of drinking, takes place. And this is from the point of view of Kim, who was the sailor in the previous extract. Her first port of call was the Manmo Temple in Shengwan, where she burnt incense to honour her grandmother, Lily, the family's last all-powerful matriarch. This neighbourhood had been ravaged by plague 2 centuries ago, her ancestors dropping like flies. Depending on your point of view, the British had either condemned the local population by corralling them in unsanitary conditions, or saved them with their Western medicine and fancy sewerage system. As if in recognition of this dichotomy of views, roughly half of Kim's family continued to pine for the days of the Crown Colony, while the rest cautiously welcomed the advent of Chinese governorship. Whatever their political leanings, no one could disagree that the descendants of the plague survivors were being forced out of Shengwan by rabid gentrification. Not a single member of Kim's extended family could afford today's inflated rents. Her uncle's noodle shop had been wildly popular right up until its closure in 2014. Once he stopped increasing his prices at the same rate the landlord increased his, he was screwed. Kim had tried to talk him into trying his hand at selling something else, but noodles were all he knew. His sons had already left to pursue careers in Canada and the States, and said they were too busy to help her change his mind. Now that Granny was dead, there was nothing to stop Kim's brother and remaining cousins from swallowing their pride and applying for public housing. But the waiting list was long, and they probably shared Kim's suspicion that Granny was watching for any shameful acts from behind a half-closed curtain. Yes, Kim had successfully hidden her pole dancing days from Granny, but that didn't mean she was positive Granny would never find out about them. Rest in peace, she whispered, before abandoning her mixed emotions. Wish you were here, Granny. Next, she faced the prospect of giving a guitar lesson to a high-flying, high-rise dwelling creep in Kennedy Town. Typically, this paunchy pale-face in ill-fitting designer jeans already thought he was twice as good as he would ever become on his Les Paul copy. Worse, his confidence extended to fantasies of seducing his long-suffering tutor. She groaned at the prospect of him using the heat as an excuse to unbutton his shirt, or the aircon as a reason for them to get cosy on the couch. Men. She'd had enough of their reptile brains. Only Frank gave her hope for the species, and soon he'd be gone. People are taken away all the time, said Jeannie, pouring another Jack Daniels. I had a couple from the US in here. They've lost their son. Not dead, necessarily. They just don't know where he is. At least you and Frank can keep in contact until things are sorted out. You mean Jonathan's parents, don't you? Kim took a slug. Frank talks about him sometimes. Not much, but I know he likes the boy. Yes, he's still their little boy too. Parents worry. Imagine finding out your son or daughter was one of the kids leading the protests. Are you closing up today? Kim glanced at the clock above the bar. Not today. Jeannie picked up her mop and resumed damping the terracotta tiles. They need somewhere to come and talk after the marching's done, somewhere to relax. How are the police these days? Wrapped around my finger, Jeannie smiled, admiring an imaginary wedding ring. What about you, Kim Tang? Are you taking care of yourself? I'm okay. It's Frank, Kim sighed. Maybe I've been too hard on him. I said he had grown numb. It's hard for them, these restless men, the artists especially, Jeannie told her. If they achieve their dreams young, they go crazy and drink or drug themselves to death. If they don't make it, they get depressed, go underwater, leave you snatching at the bubbles. But eventually, if they meet the right partner, they learn to accept their fate. He won't stay numb forever, not Frank. Not with you to love him. I know he reads his poetry in here sometimes. Kim noticed a crack in her voice. I know other times he sings and dances on the table. Why can't he do that with me? He's shy. Jeannie stopped mopping and came over. He's a shy extrovert. They all are. The British especially. That's why they created such a messed up empire. Except in Hong Kong, Kim said quietly. They did okay here. Jeannie put an arm around her. You've asked your parents about that, have you? What do you mean? Never mind. There's enough politics happening now to keep us busy. Another drink? One more. Kim looked back up at the clock. I haven't eaten yet. Jeannie grabbed a menu after splashing some more amber into Kim's glass. I'll order you a takeaway. The sushi up the road is pretty good. It's okay, she grimaced. My client gets me lunch. It's part of the deal.